Welcome, everyone. Welcome to the Diverse Recovery Workshop series. Tonight's workshop is Family Feud, Weight Inclusive Eating Disorder Recovery within the Family Systems. My name is Sabrina. I use they, them pronouns, and I am the program director, one of the program directors at the Eating Disorder Foundation in Denver. The Diverse Recovery Workshop series is brought to you in collaboration with the Eating Disorder Foundation and Pathlight, Eating Recovery Center, Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center. A little bit about the Eating Disorder Foundation, and then I'll pass along to one of the community outreach liaisons from Eating Recovery Center, Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center to share a little more about their resources. So the Eating Disorder Foundation was founded in 2003, and our mission is to be an effective resource in the prevention and elimination of eating disorders through free and accessible education, support, and advocacy. We are a Denver-based foundation that is now serving individuals and families on an international level. I just want to quickly thank everybody who was able to contribute a donation when they registered for the event this evening. EDF is able to continue providing services for free because of the contributions of our community. I'll go ahead and add a donation link if that's something you're interested in and able to do. And I just again thank you all for showing up and for contributing in the ways that you can. For tonight's workshop, if you have any questions throughout the presentation, I'll encourage you to use the chat feature. We'll keep that confidential and closed, so your questions or comments can come directly to me, and then we'll save some time at the end of the presentation for some questions and responses, and I'll deliver those to our speaker this evening. We're not going to share the PowerPoint tonight, but we are recording, so you'll be able to come back and revisit the information. And now I'll hand it over to Emma Boyate, ERC's Community Outreach Liaison, to share a little about our speaker tonight and Eating Recovery Center.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Sabrina. So as Sabrina said, my name is Emma Boyata, and I'm one of the community outreach liaisons at the Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center. Eating Recovery Center and Pathlight Mood and Anxiety Center's mission is to deliver the highest quality treatment for patients and their loved ones with eating disorders and mood, anxiety, and trauma-related disorders. ERC Pathlight offers the full spectrum of treatment services, including inpatient, residential, partial hospitalization, and intensive outpatient programs for adults, adolescents, and children of all genders. It is my pleasure tonight to introduce our speaker, Meredith Nisbet. She is a licensed I just said your name again. She is a licensed marriage and family therapist and a certified eating disorder specialist supervisor. She currently serves as the National Clinical Response Manager of the Clinical Response Team at ERC Pathlight, where she engages with patients, families, and providers seeking admissions nationwide. In addition to her work at ERC Pathlight, and she has her private practice with Three Birds Counseling. Meredith also provides education and training on weight stigma and health at every size informed care around the country. Meredith earned her bachelor's degree from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill and her master's degree from East Carolina University. Meredith resides in Raleigh, North Carolina, where she spends her free time listening to true crime podcasts, practicing hot yoga, and snuggling with her dog, Mac. Meredith, thank you so much for presenting tonight.
Thanks, Emma, and thanks to EDF for having me. I'm excited to be here and talk about a topic that I haven't talked about in quite some time, which is family systems. I do quite a lot of presentations on weight inclusive, fat affirming eating disorder care, but excited to get back to my roots in family therapy and talk a little bit about that tonight, because I know it's kind of a hot button topic for folks, especially as they're transitioning maybe out of higher levels of care and back home, or if you're living at home, obviously in your family environment while you're in treatment, like outpatient treatment. So very excited to talk with everyone tonight. I do want to let everyone know that this presentation is a little heavy on theory. Emma and I were talking about this earlier, but really in order to kind of get an understanding of our nervous systems and the way that they work and what physiologically is happening in our bodies when there is a threat in the family, and how that impacts our recovery and how we can support our recovery in response to that. I do have to give kind of an overview of several different therapy theories and just kind of some more academic information. So just prepare yourself for that. I promise I'll keep it exciting and give examples, and I'm not going to make you snooze tonight, hopefully. If you enjoy this presentation, if you're interested in the type of information that I'm producing tonight, feel free to follow me on Instagram at Therapy with Mare. I usually post any article contributions or upcoming presentations that I'm doing there. If you're interested in this kind of content, I would love to have you. Just a quick note on language before we get started. In this presentation, I will not be using the term fat as a derogatory term, and I won't be using the words obese or obesity because those are rooted in the pathologization of bodies and can be really triggering for folks. I will not be using them, and that is why. What I will be using is the word fat as a neutral descriptor. So similar to the way that we would say someone is tall or short, old or young, just like that. There's a pretty big movement in the fat activist community to reclaim the word fat. It has been used pretty negatively against our community for a really long time, and it's a lot of folks are starting to reclaim that word and use it in different ways, neutral ways. I understand that's not for everybody, and some folks have a really tough history with the word fat, especially if they were bullied or have experienced a significant amount of stigma or trauma related to their body size. Totally understandable, and I always just like to say that don't feel like you have to adopt that, or also just to acknowledge that it's okay if the use of the word fat as a neutral descriptor still brings up big feelings for you. Completely understandable, which is why I kind of give a disclaimer at the beginning so it doesn't catch folks off guard and you know where I'm coming from. I'll also use terms interchangeably, person of size or person in a larger body throughout the presentation. So to begin, let's talk a little bit about what a system is. So a system is a group of people who have common or interrelated elements. So interrelated elements might be family members or common objectives or goals. They also have what we call clear and cohesive behaviors, which means that you're able to tell who belongs in the system based on what they're saying, doing, trying to do, things like that. They interact regularly and in patterns. So again, this is something very visible that we can see, especially over time. If you spend enough time either in a system or adjacent to a system, you can start to kind of pick out the patterns that are happening, either in the way that they talk to each other, the way they interact in general, the goals that they're working towards. Those are visible to folks on the outside if they spend enough time adjacent to the system. Elements of the system or groups of people who are interdependent on one another. So this can be in several different ways. So for example, you can be physically interdependent, like you need to live together, emotionally, financially. There's lots of different ways that we can be interdependent on one another as human beings. And this is why systems theory in general is so applicable to humans at large, because there are all kinds of different systems. So a couple of different examples of systems that you've probably either been in or seen might be a sports team. We have a coach, we have players, and then within the player subsystem, you have different roles. So you might have, in baseball, you might have an umpire, a catcher, a pitcher, all of these different roles within, they're all working towards this common goal, and they all behave in specific patterns, whether that's during a game, at practice, after a game has been won or lost. There are rules within that system and kind of things that govern them. Other types of systems that you might be familiar with are work environments. So at a company, you might have an owner, a manager, and then many employees. In families, we have obviously parents, children, and then siblings, kind of parallel between the children, and then extended family as well. And then even friends can form systems. So if you think about your friend group, it's not always as obvious, but typically if you start to ask people about their friends, who would you identify as the comedian in your friend group? Who would you identify as like the mom or the caretaker, the one who's going to make sure everybody gets home okay? Or like if you need a Band-Aid, they probably have one. Who of your friend group is more chaotic? What rules are governing that friend group? There are lots of ways that we interact in these systems. And although all of these systems are different, they're all made of unique elements, they all have different rules, each individual system is going to reflect some sort of theme that's going to be shaped by these implicit messages and rules. So sometimes these things are stated out loud, especially in families, from parents to children. Oftentimes you will hear kind of repeated phrases or repeated family rules, and we'll talk a little bit more about those further on and give some examples of those. But in general, a lot of these are going to be implicit, and it's just kind of a mindset or a way of thinking. So this might be, in our family, we take care of others. Our family doesn't trust outsiders, stranger danger. Early is on time is late. Respect your elders. These are all kind of implicit messages and rules that exist within systems that form kind of the theme of that system. And since today we'll be talking about families, if you're needing help identifying what some of your family's messages are, think about things related to your family that you've had to explain to outsiders. So like if you've ever brought a friend home or brought a new partner home, or anyone who has kind of come into your system, even briefly, and you've had to kind of give them an operating manual of sorts. So that might be, when my partner met my dad for the first time, I remember saying to him, like, my dad is really big on manners and politeness. And so, make sure that you shake his hand when you meet him and say, yes, sir, if he asks you a question, things like that. And those are part of the rules of my family system. And so think about that in the context of your own family, kind of as we go through this presentation, and that'll give you an idea of kind of how some of these more supportive elements are applicable to your family and your family system rules. So family systems theory says that individuals are much better understood when they're not isolated from their systemic context. So to give you an example, if I have a 14-year-old girl who comes in for therapy and she is telling me that she's having these really severe depressive symptoms, she's sad all the time, she's crying a lot, she's having trouble sleeping. As a therapist, I could treat her depressive symptoms. I could help her with some coping skills and kind of talk therapy to help her process through her emotions. And I could continue to do that and wait for improvement, which would typically eventually happen. This is, there's a lot of different ways that people see change in therapy, but as a family therapist, what I do and what I feel is most effective is I zoom out and I look at what's happening in her family system that might be impacting her mental health. And for this example, I'm saying family system, but I've had adolescents come to me where we've talked about their friend system at school, or I've had adults come in and we're talking about their work system, whatever it may be that's impacting them. It's important to understand them in their context. And so if I have, like I said, this 14-year-old girl who comes in with depression and we're kind of talking about, tell me what's going on in your family. How's your relationship with your brother? How's your relationship with your dad, with your mom? What is your relationship? What is the relationship like between your parents? What about your parents and your brother? Trying to kind of get my sea legs, so to speak, in this family system. And what I might find is that this particular person is fighting with her dad, and she has been fighting with her dad as long as she can remember, and it's beginning to impact her mental health pretty dramatically, and is kind of starting to integrate into her self-image and the way that she perceives herself, as the bad kid. Like, why doesn't my dad fight with my brother? He only fights with me, things like that. And so when we're looking at it from a family systems theory perspective, we know that everything in the system impacts everything in the system. So if I'm talking about this girl and her dad, I can't even just look at this girl and her dad. I have to take a look at what's dad's relationship with mom? What is each parent's relationship individually with the brother? What about together with the brother? What about the brother and the sister? I kind of have to understand everything, all of the different interconnected webs that are happening in this family in order to understand what interactions, actions, and reactions are at play here. So what we know is that patterns of interaction create and maintain behaviors, and these behaviors can be both problematic and non-problematic. So the way to picture this is that family systems, like any other system, if you think about like an ecosystem, family systems seek homeostasis. So whatever those implicit rules or messages or beliefs of the family are, that is homeostasis for this family. And what that means is that the family is constantly going to be working to maintain that homeostasis, even if there are negative consequences to that, even if it is an abusive homeostasis, even if it is an unhealthy homeostasis, even if homeostasis is causing negative impacts on some other member of the family, the system itself is still going to seek homeostasis. And so an example here would be, negative example of how patterns of interaction create and maintain behaviors would be a parent who has, either a low emotional intelligence, they were just never taught how to deal with their emotions, or maybe who has poor boundaries, they were never taught how to set boundaries. They align against their spouse with their child. And this really tips the balance in the family, and does what we call parentifies the child, and really involves the child in the marital relationship. Essentially, it puts the child right in between the two spouses. And so when that happens, let's say that, mom's upset at dad because she feels neglected, and then she aligns with the daughter, and there's, this alliance against dad. That's the new homeostasis. And so the system is going to continue to go in that circle. Mom's going to continue to lean on the daughter for the emotional needs that she typically would get met by her partner. And daughter is going to continue to try to meet those needs, because as children, we want to do what our parents are asking of us or needing us to do. And over time, that's going to continue to push dad away. And so in therapy, we look at how do we right side this? How do we get things back balanced? I think that is true whether it's a negative or a positive situation. We just want to make sure that there's balance in the system, and that the homeostasis that the system is seeking makes sense for everyone in the family and isn't giving more power to one person or the other. Something that I think is particularly poignant about this, and probably will resonate with a lot of you, is that people solicit each other's attention, approval, and support, and they react to each other's needs, expectations, and upsets. And if you think about the systems in your life, whether it's a friend system or a family system or a work system or what have it, I think you will find that that is true. And sometimes that can help us identify what systems we're in. If I'm, looking for someone else's approval or attention, how am I trying to do that? And how is that impacting the system? What is it reinforcing? What we know is that we are constantly recreating our family cycle. It's good and it's bad. It gives us a lot of opportunities to do something different because we're constantly engaging in those behaviors that seek homeostasis, but it also gives us a lot of opportunities to be drawn back into the system. And so again, the goal of the system is always to take the path of least resistance towards homeostasis. And this means that all of the elements or all of the people within the system are also going to do their best to enforce that. And so sometimes we'll see things like, for example, if you get into a fight with your dad and your brother calls a day later and is kind of like, hey, how are things going? Tell me what's new, and you chit chat for a little while, and maybe your brother ends the phone call with like, dad's still really upset about that argument that you had. You should really call him so that family dinner on Sunday isn't awkward. And maybe this argument that you had with your dad, you were trying to set a boundary. You were trying to say something like, hey, I don't appreciate when you comment on the amount of food on my plate, or I don't appreciate when you make comments about the type of food that I'm eating. That's not supportive to me in recovery. And then to have other members of your family system kind of jump in when you're trying to do something that's healthy for you and setting that boundary and advocating for yourself. You might have other people in the system respond negatively to that because it throws off the whole system, and they feel that, right? Like, we feel dad's discomfort. We feel that dad is upset with you. We feel that there's conflict here. And we know that the next time we are together as a family system, or even if you're physically distanced from your family, the next time that I talk to dad on the phone, I know he's going to be ranting about this argument that you had. They feel that change in the system, and they end up doing their best to enforce whatever that homeostasis is. So as young children, we learn these rules, messages, beliefs, and the goals or objectives of our family system, and we take them on and we start to play our own role in the system. And that means that we're interacting with other people in our family and enforcing these problematic and non-problematic behaviors. So that's something that just happens naturally when we're kids. You grow up in a family, and I would imagine that probably all of you can identify one family message or family belief that you learned when you were a kid that just, you could probably just pull it out right now and say exactly what it is, because it is so ingrained. But the reason that it's important is because as we get older, we really internalize these messages and beliefs that come from our family, and they become the core of our identity, whether they're positive or negative, whether they say good or bad things about who I am as a person, how I fit into this family, what our goals are as a family. Those really become the core of our identity. And that starts to impact our relationships with others, how we see the world, and how we view other people. So I remember in graduate school, someone was explaining to me the concepts of modern and postmodern therapy, which do not matter and I'm not going to talk about. But they were breaking it down for me, and they said, we can break these two different things down to one question. Do you think people are generally good, or do you think people are generally bad? And I remember sitting with a group of students and kind of talking through everybody's views of that question and what their answers were. And some people had like an initial answer where they were like, oh, people are terrible. And then they went, wait, that's not true. People really are trying their best. And we kind of were having conversations about, well, what did your family believe about other people? And what have you learned as an adult? And how do those things differ? Or, has it stayed the same? Are you really still aligned with that core belief that you have? But if we go back to that question, do you think people are generally good? Or do you think people are generally bad? That one answer determines how you view problems. It determines how you view solutions, relationships, and other people. And this is what it means to have a core identity based on family messages, rules, and beliefs. You have something that is really just kind of, I think of it as like whatever color lenses you have on your glasses that came from your family. That's what we're looking at. And it really impacts everything around us. But most importantly, it impacts our nervous system. And that's what's going to be really important for us to understand today, is how and why that happens. So internalization of these types of messages is significant because our emotional framework is built around them. Because this starts when we're so young, as young children, our frontal lobes aren't developed, and the family beliefs are what either keep us safe or give us guidance on how to belong in our family and also in the world. Because at such a young age, we can't differentiate between what it means to belong in our family and what it means to belong in the world. And so because our frontal lobe is not fully developed, we need guidance on decision making, and we use kind of a good bad dichotomy to do that. So if you know anything about child development, what we learn is that children really struggle with landing in these spaces of black and white, good and bad. And it's very easy for them to kind of sort things into categories, this black and white thinking, because that is a tool that we have used for millennia to keep ourselves safe. It's part of what I call our lizard brain in the back of our heads, from when we lived in caves and were being chased by woolly mammoths. You have to be able to make decisions very quickly, and a lot of them are life or death. Now, we're not necessarily making life or death decisions every day anymore, but that little piece of our lizard brain way back here in the back of our head teaches us that a threat to our belief system or the family system, these rules that are teaching us how to stay safe, how to belong, all of that stuff. A threat to that belief system is really bad. And so that occurrence, that threat, can send us into fight, flight, or freeze, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. So I have a little example of this. So if you grow up and let's say that you have a family member who was a drill instructor in the Marine Corps, and being on time is really important, especially in the military. And that's something that was drilled into this person's head, and he taught it to his child. So as a child, you learn that your family belief and the way you belong in your family is early is on time and on time is late. And this is repeated consistently throughout your developmental years, and you got in trouble if you were late. That might be, you got yelled at, or you were just told like, oh, I can't believe you were late, some sort of negative consequence for that. And you internalize the message that being late makes you a bad person. It makes you disrespectful of other people's time. And you learn that this is a really bad thing, and that it would mean that you no longer fit in the good side of your family. The consequence of this is, as an adult, any threat of being late just sends you into a tailspin. Lots of anxiety, tension, irritability. And that is a fight or flight response to this threat from 20 years ago that would dissimulate you from your family. You would no longer belong. And that's a really powerful thing that comes through our nervous system. So let's talk a little bit about attachment theory, and then I promise we'll move on into things that are less theory heavy. So attachment theory is really important when we're talking about what's happening physiologically in our threat detection systems. And so just a little quick overview of this. Attachment theory came from this research that Bowlby, and Ainsworth completed with infants in the 1960s. And so they did something that they called the strange situation, where they would have a mom and an infant playing in a room together, think like 6 months old, playing together in a room, and mom would leave the room, and they would take a look at how the baby responded when mom left the room, and then they would send mom back in after a couple of minutes and see how the babies reacted when mom came back in. And it was really interesting because actually they were able to determine that our attachment styles are pretty much cemented by the time that we're 3 or 4 years old. And so they were able to look at the attachment styles of 3 and 4 year olds and predict with 77% accuracy if those folks would drop out of high school. So they predicted correctly out 77% of these folks if they would complete high school or if they would drop out. And it was based solely on attachment theory, based solely on the way that they responded to a threat. So out of this research came a couple of different attachment styles that are important to know. You might already know your attachment style. If you don't, I would encourage you to learn. It's something that can be really helpful in understanding how and why you respond to nervous system threats, and especially relational nervous system threats. So we have several types of attachment styles. The main two categories are secure and insecure. So secure is just kind of on an island by itself. Some folks are secure, and that's amazing for them, but they're kind of out here floating along. And then we have folks who are insecure, which is going to be the majority of us. So insecure folks can be broken down into 3 types. We have anxious ambivalent, we have disorganized, and we have avoidant. So anxious ambivalent folks, in this study that Bowlby and Ainsworth did in the 60s, these infants who were anxious ambivalent, they would cry when mom leaves, which most of the babies did. But when she came back into the room, they were absolutely inconsolable. You could not get them to cry. They were crying for 30 minutes afterwards. And so you can see the distress that they're in. Now, the secure infants, they also cried when mom left. But when mom returned, they hug her, most of them did. And then shortly after that, like within 5 minutes or so, they were able to self-regulate, calm themselves down, and just start to play again, like nothing had happened. Now, we had disorganized infants in this study who just had really strange behavior. It's called disorganized for a reason. So, for example, they would cry when mom left, but then when mom came back in the room, they might run towards her, and then right before they got there, turn around and run away. So kind of this, what I call a push-pull dynamic of, I want to be close to you, but I'm scared to be close to you. I want to be close to you, but you're a threat to me, or I perceive that you're a threat to me. This can also look like a freeze or a shutdown. So like not ignoring mom, but having just kind of this blank affect, like total shutdown, like robot mode almost. And then we have avoidant. So avoidant infants were the most interesting in this study because they do not react when mom leaves the room. They're playing with mom, they're having a great time. Mom gets up and walks out, nothing happens, no change. And when mom comes back in, they ignore her. They won't make eye contact with her. They're not displaying any sort of emotion. But what they found as they continued to study attachment styles was that, you know, if we think about our anxious folks who, you know, are just inconsolable when mom returns, they cry when she leaves, they're inconsolable when she returns. And we think about our avoidant folks who don't show any emotion when mom leaves and ignore her when she comes back. At face value, you would look at those 2 different children and say, these people are feeling very different things. But research actually shows that avoidant infants are experiencing just as much distress as the anxious infants, but they don't show it at all, which is really interesting. So if you think about folks who just really shut down in the face of a threat, they might be avoidant. So since then, attachment theory has become the basis for a lot of effective therapy techniques. I'm just going to talk about 2 really quickly. Dr. Sue Johnson has done quite a lot of work with adult partner relationships, romantic relationships, and has really proved that attachment theory goes beyond parent-child work, which is where it started. So she is the creator or developer of emotionally focused therapy, or EFT, which is something I use a lot with couples. And then Dr. Adele LaFrance, who actually does quite a lot of work with Eating Recovery Center, works with adult caregivers and patients. So if we have like an adult patient and they want their mom involved in therapy or their dad involved in therapy, excuse me, that sort of situation, she's developed this really great treatment called emotion focused family therapy, or EFFT, and that's been found to be really effective in treating eating disorders. And this is pretty significant because family-based treatment has kind of always been the gold standard for folks under 18, but has not been studied as much in adults or found to be as effective in adults. Excuse me. And so EFFT is very effective with adults and is really kind of reiterating this idea that family systems work, and working with folks in groups is really, really effective for the treatment of lots of different things, but specific to Adele LaFrance's work to eating disorders. And we know this because in systemic work, you know, with parents, with partners, with caregivers, whoever, attachment theory helps give us context for this emotional action and reaction that's happening in these systems. And again, like how they're seeking homeostasis and what impact that's having on people in the system. Attachment theory and the autonomic nervous system are also important to talk about. So our autonomic nervous system has two parts. It actually has three parts, but the two important parts are parasympathetic and sympathetic. Parasympathetic is going to be what people know as rest and digest, and sympathetic is going to be what people know as fight or flight. And I would add a third one, fight, flight, or freeze. And these two parts of our autonomic nervous system are meant to counterbalance each other. We're supposed to be threat activated, right? We want to stay safe. We want to stay well, and then we need to be able to come back into rest and digest so that we can, get better, feel better, heal, calm down, all those things. Now, folks can get stuck in one state or the other for too long. We can get stuck in rest and digest so that our threat system does not activate at all anymore. And we can get stuck in fight, flight, or freeze so that we can't get back into rest and digest. And this can have systemic consequences on physiological health, on mental health, all of these things. So attachment wounds in the context of family systems, all of these things that we're talking about, or attachment threats, they feel like life or death. Like I mentioned, back when we lived in caves and we were being chased by woolly mammoths, we had to live together to survive. Humans lived in groups and villages and, tribes. That was the way that we survived. And so because of that, we are wired for connection. Isolation is something that is inherently traumatizing to humans, and we do everything that we can to avoid it. We need connection, we need understanding in order to thrive. And really, what our brains and our bodies know is that connection is survival. And on the flip side of this kind of threat system, attachment also helps us function better. So folks with healthy attachment and nervous system regulation have less health issues, and they cope more effectively with physical pain, which is really interesting. So Sue Johnson did a study in 2013 where she was going to start treating couples for therapy, and she had one partner go and get a brain scan while receiving a shock to like the foot ankle area. And as expected, when the patient received the shock to the foot and ankle, her brain scan lit up like the 4th of July with all of her pain receptors. And she said, hey, that hurt, ow, that hurt. They had her partner come in and hold her hand while she received a second scan and a second shock. And the partner holding her hand changed nothing. Her brain scan still lit up like the 4th of July. The shock still hurt. She still expressed that it hurt. And then this couple, along with many others, went through 12 sessions of emotion-focused therapy, couples therapy. And at the end, they did a repeat of this scan and shock kind of system. And the partner went back in. She got her brain scanned as she was being shocked. And same thing happened. There was no change when she was by herself. Scan still lit up. She still experienced a lot of pain. So they said, hey, let's send in a stranger to hold her hand while she's receiving this shock. Let's see how that changes things. So the stranger holding her hand during the shock actually did impact the scan a little bit. Like there was marginally less findings on the scan. And she said that still hurt pretty bad. Like it's just kind of a marginal difference in pain with the stranger holding a hand. So then they sent her partner back in again. And remember, this was after 12 sessions of very intense emotion-focused couple therapy, kind of the recommitment to their relationship and all of this. So they have the partner hold her hand again, and she undergoes this last final shock. And what we see on the scan is incredible. Her scan only lights up in a couple of places. So before it was lit up all over. Now there's just a little bit of things that are lit up, but essentially no threat or alarm activity in the brain, which is really strange. And she says to the researcher, like, I mean, that was uncomfortable, but it didn't really hurt. And so in this research, what we see is that the way that we are attached to other people, our connection with other people, when I say connection is survival, I mean it. So when we think about it in the context of connection with other people is actually what can help me heal. It's what can help me feel less pain. That's really meaningful and important. And we need to know that, the role that our nervous system and our connection to others in this family system are playing when it comes to our distress tolerance, especially when we're trying to make change in the system. So when we're trying to deviate from that homeostasis, we can get really activated as other members of the system are trying to pull us back into that homeostasis. And what happens here is that that's a threat. So our sympathetic nervous system gets activated, and the logical part of our brain just shuts off, goes totally offline, windows shut down noise. We are not able to process any new information. So we call that activation. We are then relying solely on our connection and our nervous system to help us regulate and get back to where our logic center boots back up. So that's really important to know. So when we're coming back home from eating disorder recovery, or if you're living at home while you're undergoing like outpatient treatment, wherever you are in your family system or whenever you're returning to your family system, these are things that I hear from people quite a lot. What I want is emotional support. I want someone maybe to eat meals with me and help distract me. I want validation of my recovery behaviors or beliefs, or I want validation of my lack of disordered behaviors. I want you to normalize my experience. I want you to understand how hard this has been and like what a journey it's been. And when we go back into our family systems, unfortunately, what we often get are things like emotional triggers, habitual relationship patterns, and urges to participate in family homeostasis, which really, for folks who are focused on recovery, what that looks like and what that means beyond this word homeostasis is that we're getting the urge to slide right back into our system. We want to abide by these family rules and beliefs, even if they don't feel compatible with our recovery. And that's really important because, like I said, anytime that we're not, anytime we're trying to make change in the system, anytime that we're trying to, maybe have a different belief or go with a different rule or whatever it is, that can cause that in itself, and also the reaction from other members of the system can cause an attachment threat. And then we can become paralyzed. We can become, our logic center shuts off and we just don't know what to do. So that, as you're going home, that's something, or living at home, that's something to really look for as you're starting to make change and kind of assert your recovery, is just acknowledging and knowing that it is the natural direction of the system to try and pull you back in. And it's something that you will have to repeat a lot in order for it to really set in and change the system. So some common family beliefs about eating disorders, and I'm sure that you all could give me many, many more, that I hear are things like, well, they just need to eat, or insert behavior here, or they just need to stop eating, or insert behavior here. We can hear that the family thinks that the person with the eating disorder or the mental health concern is out of control, or that they lack self-control, or, well, they're just seeking attention. They just want my attention. This person could also be made out to be like the scapegoat or the problem child in the family. You can also hear things like, well, your body is problematic and it needs to be fixed. Whatever fixed means in your family, because it will depend entirely on the rules of your family system. We might also hear or see that our family believes that eating disorders aren't real, or maybe we think they're real, but we don't validate their existence. So maybe we sweep them under the rug. That's not something that we talk about. Or, minimizing. So, well, everybody has problems. And also just general confusion. Like, I don't understand eating disorders. I don't know what they are. I don't get what the big deal is. What kind of help do you need? What am I supposed to do? These are all really common things that I hear. Either I hear families directly say, patients tell me that they say, or I'm watching an interaction between family members and going, whew, that person really thinks that this person with an eating disorder is seeking attention. Like, we need to do some education here. So I want you to think about these common beliefs, or maybe what a common belief is in your family about eating disorders or mental health, and think about it in the context of attachment wounds. So each of these misachievements, where we are just on different pages, is a threat to the nervous system. So an example here would be an eating disorder patient who is in a larger body, whose family doesn't believe that they have a restrictive eating disorder, like atypical anorexia, because of the size of their body. Now, this is a perceived threat to this patient's relationship with her family or her attachment, because the family believes that people in larger bodies just eat too much. That's kind of black and white thinking, like people in larger bodies just eat too much. That's our family belief, end of. So when you have this patient who is in really deep emotional pain and wants to be believed by others, wants to be validated by these people that she loves, and wants to hear them say, like, hey, we see that you're in pain and we recognize that, and we want you to know that, like, we get it. And that doesn't happen, her nervous system might become frozen because she feels like she can't win. The attachment threat is just too severe. And oftentimes what we'll see is that folks, end up continuing to engage or starting to re-engage in eating disorder behaviors, but they feel even more shame around them. And they're less likely or able to receive help because they're stuck in this kind of tug of war between, I can choose my recovery, I can choose myself, and I can be abandoned by my family because of this belief. Or I can choose to stay within my family and to have this safety of my family, and I can not pursue recovery, which, it can be really dangerous. And if not medically dangerous, emotionally dangerous, mentally dangerous. So just food for thought there, pun unintended. So changing the system to support recovery, because that's really what we have to do when we're coming back into this system that is really detrimental to us in some ways, but also that we need or want to survive. We have to work on changing that system. So just a couple of ways that you can do that. Primarily focusing on nervous system regulation. Like I said, our brains go offline when they're threatened, and we have to bring them back online and regulate our nervous system before we can do anything, before we can respond in any productive way, and also before we can reconnect with these people. I think the good news is, because everything that we do impacts everyone else in the system, we can create change in the system by creating change in ourselves. So nervous system regulation, I think, is not that it's a cliche, but we talk about it so much in therapy that sometimes it's like in one ear and out the other. But the truth is, it's truly so impactful because, like I said, we're able to create change in other people in this system by creating change in ourselves. And nervous system regulation is one of the best tools for that. So things like breath work, whether that's box breathing, whether it's 4-7-8 breathing, whatever your preference is there, you can Google a ton of different ways to do that. Temperature change. So I'll often ask my clients to dunk their face in ice water, which sounds really unpleasant and might not be super fun, but will definitely shock your system. Or, if you don't want to dunk your whole face, you can run your this side of your wrist under cold water to help with temperature change and kind of, again, shocking the system. Another thing that folks often find helpful, if neither of the, the breath work or the temperature change, either if they don't like them, they're not accessible, they don't feel they work as well. Another thing that can be helpful is something called emotional freedom technique, which is a technique of tapping meridian points on the body. And this is bilateral nervous system stimulation. And so what that does is it tells our brain, hey, we're safe. It's okay to come back online. So you can search EFT tapping and find all sorts of information and videos about it, but it's something that I really recommend when folks are struggling to regulate. You can do it anywhere. Finding individual beliefs and values and using them to create a values-based life is really important. So recognizing, like, what are my individual values rather than my family values? And are there gaps that exist between those two things? Are there things that my family believes that I don't believe? Are there things that I believe that my family doesn't believe? And how do we kind of bridge the gap to create safety and connection while also allowing kind of, you want to have a safe home base to go back to with your family, but you also want to be able to explore independently and have your own beliefs and values in your own life. Another thing that's really important is boundaries. I know that that's kind of another therapy cliche, but again, it's so good. We have to talk about it all the time. So you have to decide what your boundaries are in recovery and what you are willing to tolerate or not willing to tolerate from your family system. And these tools all kind of work together. So like, finding my individual beliefs and values and understanding what I want my life to look like or my recovery to look like based on those values, and then setting boundaries according to that, right, with this family system. And then as they respond and react to what you're doing, that can create a threat for you, and you're going to need that nervous system regulation to come back online and be able to respond from a sense of self and not from a sense of threat. So really all of these things are intended to prioritize, encourage you to prioritize the needs of the self in order to maintain healthy connectedness to others. So I have to put myself first and take care of myself in order to then be able to get back into this family system and make change or have healthy relationships with those folks. Really quickly, as I know we're coming up on time, I do want to run through just some considerations for how we support recovery throughout the lifespan, taking in this information about family systems and the nervous system and all of that kind of stuff, attachment. So in childhood, we are learning family beliefs, and that's something that's going to, like I mentioned earlier, kind of track us through life as part of our identity. So I think it's really important at this age to teach our kids about body diversity, and to acknowledge that health is multifaceted and not correlated with body size, and to teach them how to respond when folks are saying negative things about other people's bodies or their body or what have you. The division of responsibility in feeding is also really important here, especially for supporting like healthy development of feeding instincts. So the division of responsibility in feeding by Ellen Satter says essentially that adults or parents are responsible for what and when we eat, and that kids are responsible for if and how much they eat. So really preserving that lets kids use their natural instincts when it comes to if and how much they eat. And really the exception to this would be if you're in eating disorder treatment as a child after you've had some sort of disruption to your natural instincts. In adolescence, this is really where we're forming our identity and we're strengthening our role in the system that we exist in. And so it's important at that age, whether you are that age or you have a family member or a child that's that age, that you are aware of implicit family messages and beliefs and how those might be internalized and carried on later. It's also really important to consider family balance and appropriately boundaried or leveled relationships. So when I say a leveled relationship, I mean, parents are on the same level, children are on the same level, but parents and children are on different levels. So we don't want a parent and a child on the same level. We want generally balanced relationships in the family. It's also super important here as with this strengthening of their role in the system at this point in development, to do what I call making what is covert overt. And so an example of this, especially when it comes to weight inclusivity, body diversity, we all are coming into all of our relationships with our own stuff, whatever it might be. And so especially with kids, adolescents, it's really important to make things that are unsaid to say them. So this might look like saying to an adolescent, like, hey, I know that you might be concerned about your body changing because you've heard me as your parent or your sibling or whoever talk negatively about my body changing. I just want to let you know that is my own stuff, and that you do not need to feel bad or scared of your body changing. This is something that's totally normal. Bringing up that space for conversation there is really important at that age. In adulthood and midlife, there's a lot here, but adulthood and midlife, we start to seek independence and then we have independence. But what's big here is that we're learning to operate in the system as an adult and not a child. Relationships are shifting because of that, and so is, or so should, the system, but sometimes they don't, and it can cause relational conflict. And so I think acknowledging these shifts and acknowledging bodily autonomy and acknowledging that it's normal to unlearn and give up family beliefs that don't suit you as an adult, and also to normalize experimentation and exploration in that kind of young adulthood phase, whether that's like trying new types of food, experimenting with textures, flavors, cooking styles, whatever it is really important. Two, creating routines and identity with what is often more physical distance from the system, really learning who you are and what that looks like in the world. We also start to, maybe find partners, whether they're, temporary or long-term. And it's really, poignant here to work towards secure attachment and trust and communication with your partner, because that's going to foster better physical and emotional intimacy, which helps support recovery. Again, connection is survival. But we also know that to have close connection, we have to be vulnerable. Working through our attachment traumas and our barriers and learning to communicate those openly with your partner is really important. We also start to form our own family systems here at that phase of life. And so at some point we become, the top of the triangle, and we become the ones who are setting those messages and beliefs into place. And so we have to decide, what beliefs and messages from our nuclear family serve us and which ones don't. With pregnancy and postnatal, and kind of together with that parenting and partnership, if you're someone who wants to or has born children, honoring the power in your body as it's changing to accommodate another person, right? Or even if you aren't a person who wants children or is able to bear children, still honoring this transition if you do choose to have children in other ways. You are balancing keeping another human alive while keeping your partnership alive, while keeping yourself alive. And that takes really strong boundaries and really strong nervous system regulation. So I think all of these are kind of places where sometimes we see people stumble a little bit on their recovery journey, or maybe regress a little bit and then kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, because recovery is about the journey and not the destination. So it's just good to be aware of the things that are happening here. The last one is with aging, empty nesting and kind of turning back towards that partner companionship. If you have a partner, if your partner's still living, you really have to evaluate, like, who are we without the other members of the system? And when you start to turn towards each other again, sometimes we find deficits in connection or attachment that have just kind of gone unnoticed in the flow of the family system. But we need to repair them once they become evident in order to maintain a strong recovery. That is all I have for you this evening. I'm going to leave this resources slide up. If you would like to write things down or take a screenshot, you're welcome to. And then we don't have much time for questions, but I'm happy to answer a couple if we do have any.
Thank you so much, Meredith. I'll have one question, and then I'll allow if anybody just wants in this last minute to send in anything else. So to just clarify, the last slide you were on, really recognizing the lifespan. If someone is in the later part of their lifespan in 60s, 70s, 80s, and doesn't have access, whether it's estrangement of family members or family members are deceased, can we still do, or should I maybe ask, is it still helpful to look at both sides of that family system as like when we were a younger person, and so our grandparents that we may not have access to, but how that role impacts how we are in the family system that we have now in our own kind of age range?
Yeah, absolutely. I always think it's so interesting. I remember I used to come home from grad school when I was becoming a therapist, and I would ask my parents so many questions about their families. And I just wanted to know, like, where do you come from? Like, who taught you this? How did, like, why are we like this, good or bad? Why are we the way that we are? And I think it is really, really important to look at that. Maybe not important is the right word. I've said that a lot, but really meaningful to just look at where we've come from and all of the things that have kind of trickled down into that. And I think too, one other note on aging that I can't believe I didn't put on there, but as our bodies change, as we age, like as we become less mobile or we struggle with health conditions or whatever that may be, that can be really threatening to our nervous system and also to our family system. So that's something to keep an eye out for. Or if, you know, like you said, if you're estranged, if you don't have much connection familially, that's where we go back to kind of that first slide about family systems, and that like systems are everywhere. Like you can plug into a system anywhere you are, and find connection anywhere you are. I think, you know, another plug for EDF, I just think they're a great organization, but like if you're in need of connection, this is a great organization for, you know, free supportive connection, especially with relationship to eating disorders. But you know, you can find your community anywhere you are.
Thank you. Do you have time for one more question?
Absolutely.
Okay. How do you find that this correlates to internal family systems or IFS?
Yes.
And do you find one being more meaningful for treating eating disorders in your opinion?
Yeah, no, I love this question. It's funny because I hated IFS when I first read about it and learned about it. I was like, this makes no sense. Why would we conceptualize anything this way? And then I find myself nearly 10 years later as a therapist using IFS and parts language all the time. And I conceptualize them pretty similarly. I'm an attachment therapist and family systems is my jam. And so that's what I work with folks on a regular basis. And so I often will, you know, we'll bounce from talking about somebody's family system to talking about the system that's in their head. You know, we'll say, hey, you know, folks who are really, you know, pursuing recovery, you might have one part of you that is kicking and screaming along that recovery road and is just like, this feels horrible. I don't want to do this. I can't tolerate this. And you might have this other part of you that's like, look how far we've come. Look what good we've done. Look how much better we feel. And that all of those parts of you are valid. I think the way that they interact is really interesting to talk with people about, because I find when you give people language of IFS and you start to use that parts language, people naturally fall into that. They're like, yeah, there's this one voice in my head that, you know, maybe is like my child voice. Maybe I had some trauma when I was a teen, and there's this like teenager voice in my head that's very threat activated. And then there's the mom in me that, you know, wants to protect everyone. And it's not necessarily threat activation as much as it is, you know, mama bear to caretake for everyone. So I love them both. I think they work together really well. I don't prefer one or the other. I think they really inform each other.
Thank you so much. That is all of our questions, and I appreciate you and your time, Meredith. It's always so much to learn from you. And there's been additional compliments that everybody has learned a lot in the chat as well. So we're very grateful for you.
Good. So glad. Thanks for having me, and everyone have a great night. Take care.